Keep it going. It's always amazing to be able to hear from our youth and, being able to reflect with our elected officials, Peggy Flanagan and Sharice Davids. Hearing from them is such an honor and a treat. I hope you guys enjoyed that as much as I did. We want to keep it moving today, and so I'm super honored and excited to introduce a hybrid panel. We're going to have a couple Zoom guests, but we have a couple members who will be joining us on stage here, really to think about and discuss how the research has helped change the narrative over the last 6 years, advancement of representation, and how it's helped build power for Native people. So without further ado, I want to introduce our moderator for today's panel, Mark Trahant. He is the editor-at-large of Indian Country Today. He's an economist, a social justice warrior, a field reporter. He's a colleague, a mentor, a friend, and an amazing human being. So I'm excited and honored to introduce Mark here. We're also going to be joined today by Ms. Cheryl Crazybowl, the president of the American Indian College Fund and the IllumiNative board treasurer. Thanks for being here, Cheryl. And I'm also introducing Kathy Baird, who is the Chief Communications Officer for the Washington Post and one of our general board members at IllumiNative. And coming to us across the digital divide, we have Wayne Ducheneaux. He is the Chief Advancement Officer of Intertribal Agricultural Council. And Mary Kathryn Nagle, playwright, attorney, powerful matriarch. Thank you guys for joining us today, and I'm going to quit talking and get out of the way. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome. It's really great to be here, and it's funny because when you look at the topic of this panel, this is the panel for those that like to start nonfiction books by reading the bibliography. Inside joke. Let me just start with this conversation with talking about the power of research and how it informs your work. And why don't we start with Cheryl?
Madakiapi, Wachampiwi, Imachiapi, Lena, Shoshone, Lakota, Imataha, Chante, Washtena, Pe, Chuzapi. Greetings, relatives. I'm really happy to be here with you today. So I remember many, many years ago discovering the indigenous ways of knowing, kind of methodologies that were coming into being in the tribal college movement and in tribal higher education, and then having that opportunity to be at the forefront of leading efforts to bring research kind of into our everyday vocabulary, because our people had always done that. They'd always done research in different kinds of ways. And so I think of research, especially the kind of research that was done through Reclaiming Native Truth and is now being done with IllumiNative, as us using knowledge and understanding to improve our narrative and to increase the ways that, in like the case of many of our organizations, help us bring resources and investment into our community. So that's how I think of that work.
Thank you. Mary Kathryn, how do you approach research, and how does it inform your work?
Well, I think it's really important to understand how the courts operate in the United States today, specifically because a lot of the questions that determine our rights are being decided in the courts. And so when you think about questions like, does the government closest to me, my tribal government, have the right to protect me in my own home? That is a question that Congress is taking action on, but ultimately whether or not, Congress is able to restore the inherent right of our governments to protect our own citizens on our own lands ends up getting decided in the courts. And, I think we see a lot of increase in terms of voiced action, and we're seeing our allies really stand with us, like what happened at Standing Rock, but ultimately those issues end up getting litigated in federal courts. And it's so incredibly important to have a voice there, and I think some of the research that we've been doing is really showing just where that invisibility sits, and it gives us an idea of what to focus on and what to work on, which is so incredibly important at this moment right now, because there's so much that is at stake. And so I think that for a lot of the times that we've looked at these questions, research has not been an option for us because so many doors have been closed. But thankfully, we're starting to see more and more doors open, and that also enables us to do research in a new and different way. Instead of being on the outside trying to look in, we now can go and talk to Article 3 judges that are Native American, that are Indigenous, and say, as a citizen of a federally recognized tribe or a tribal nation, what is your perspective on the federal bench? What do your colleagues say behind doors? And so it's an exciting time, and I'm sure Kathy and others who, she's at the Washington Post. I mean, once we have Native people in these different institutions where previously we were sort of not invited to the table, so to speak, the research you can do and the understanding of how we are perceived by others and how that impacts our lives and our rights, it's an exciting time to be doing that research, and I think we have new capabilities and new conversations to be had.
Thank you. Kathy, she set the table for you. So.
Thank you. Good to see you, MK. Hehana washte, mitaku yape, chante washte, nape, choose peg kisto. Good morning, relatives. I'm Kathy, as Mark had said, and I'm an enrolled citizen of the Rosebud Sioux Nation and a descendant of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, and I'm very happy to be here. I think this is such a great way to kick things off because I'm a communications professional at the Washington Post. So in full disclosure, I'm not a reporter, but it really positions me in a unique way to be able to shine a light on some of our stories and make sure that our journalism that covers our stories is widely spread. I think before I was a professional communicator, I also was just a storyteller at heart. I have a lot of background in theater, and then growing up in a Native household, just the idea of like how we tell stories and how we pass on information is done orally. And that for me has always been a big part of how I have absorbed information and be able to share information. I think where I use the research, and obviously as a professional communicator, it gives me an amazing platform. And I have worked in mainstream non-Indian spaces where I am indeed the only person in the room sometimes, or I'm a very finite group. But since the 7 years have passed since the research was originally done, I've been on the PR agency world at Ogilvy. I worked for a very tiny sports company called Nike that you may have heard of. And last but not least, as MK said, I am at the Washington Post now. And I think in these spaces, what's interesting is I don't often get up and give like a big presentation on the research around Native Americans. It doesn't come up in that way for me. It's more nuanced. It's more in how I can be a representative First Native person on the masthead of the Washington Post, for instance, but also be able to provide ways of understanding us in spaces where the moment arises, be it the mascot movement of 2020 in the name of the Washington football team. I was at the table at Nike to be able to educate and use our research there. And other spaces now, I think, that are a bit more nuanced. When I want to amplify the journalism of the Washington Post, I'm a Native woman. I don't often disclose myself. I don't necessarily greet the media I'm reaching out to with my identity. I don't even greet them in language, but I do represent, and I always want to make sure that I use the opportunities that I can to bring our stories and our research to the mainstream so that we're not just talking to ourselves.
And Wayne.
Thanks, Mark. Haumitakupi, Chante Washte Nape Chuzapi. Hello, my relatives. I greet you with a good heart and handshake. In my current role at the Intertribal Agriculture Council, a lot of our work, and the majority of our work, centers around research that's out there, everything from soil and health content to what our producers wanting to do on the ground. And we do a tremendous job of aggregating, collecting, and using data specifically to try to make sure that we are empowering our stakeholders to feed the people, right? And I think when I think about it from my IllumiNative board seat, in our perspective, like research is a key component into everything we do to help us ensure that the narrative that's getting out there around Indian country is informed by Indian country and be able to be most palatable and understandable for folks that are from non-Native communities, right? One of the things about Indian country is while we are a small population, we are mighty, and we have to really help our relatives who are non-Native understand our situations. Research is the way to do that so that we can create strong allyship in moving our work forward.
I want to ask a broad question about where story goes versus where data goes and how you fit those together. But before we go to that broad question, I have a really narrow one for MK. And that is, what is the difference in research for a play versus research for the law?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, in a very practical sense, when I research for the law, if I'm writing a brief, I go onto this database called Westfall, and I type in, I forget what the term is, like a Boolean search, or, federal court within 20, ICWA, or whatever I'm searching for cases about. I apologize if you hear my baby in the background. And you're doing a very specific search for what has the court said about this, what has the court said about that. History does play a part, but it's, you're looking to see what courts have said about a certain topic. When I do research for a play, it's much more community-based, community-driven. I do a lot of oral history interviews, and a lot of times a lot of the plays I write, I like to combine a historical event with a contemporary event and draw the parallels through the actual bodies on stage, the people who are being portrayed and their stories and their connections. And so a lot of times I'll do oral history interviews with people, with family members of, the descendants of a character who's being portrayed on stage. And it's a completely different type of research. And sometimes it's about a court case that happened in the past, or a court case that's happening now, and the history that led up to that. And so I like to think of it as sort of the human side of the court cases. But yeah, it's a very, very different kind of research, but at the end of the day, it's all storytelling, right?
Cheryl, you mentioned that we've always been research-driven. And when I think about whether it's pictographs or you can go down the list, how does that influence story, and how do you use that when you...
Yeah, so I'll just try to regroup a little bit around. So what I've observed, and I had the opportunity along with Mark and many others to be on the ground level for the Reclaiming Native Truth initiative. And it was occurring at, I had this history of working in education and working in community and being part of the cultural community on my home reservation and other settings. But at the College Fund, about the same time that all of the Reclaiming Native Truth work was going on, we were doing something, I think, in the research storytelling space that is kind of new to us as Indigenous peoples. And we were looking at what other people think. We were looking at what are other people's experiences, what is other people's knowledge, and how can we influence that? And so in the data space, we're collecting information, and we're collecting it by asking people questions. We do it through a lot of different ways, like surveys and focus groups, and that's what Reclaiming Native Truth did, and that's what IllumiNative did. And then we do it by reaching out to targeted audiences. And so we're asking someone, what do you know about Natives? Or what do you know, in our case, about education? And then we're using what they tell us to, I think I'm gonna say we're laying our story over the top of that, because then it becomes our narrative, and it becomes the way that we want to get the message across. So at the College Fund, the Reclaiming Native Truth and IllumiNative research just really aligns with the work that we do to tell a story about why education is transformative, why people should support education, so that we can create pathways for people to access education. So I think of it in that sense. And then the stories that we're telling are compelling stories, because we just have compelling stories as people. And so what we're doing is we're giving people two things that I think are really important. We're giving them a connection, because that's what people want. They want to be able to see themselves in the work, in who you are, and in the work that you do, or in your family experience, or in your education journey. So we're giving people that, but we're also giving people facts. So when you use data and you use what people are feeding back to you, you're giving them facts that are really important. So we can tell people, For example, why is education important? Because our people need to be able to manage our own resources and teach our children ourselves and provide our own health care and all of those kinds of things. And we can tell them that in a factual way. Right now, we have a crisis in Native higher education. We've had a 40% drop in the last 11 years in the number of Native people that are enrolling in college. And so I'm able to give you that fact. And then I'm able to give you the person who can tell you why it's important for you to support their education so that we can address that crisis. So that's what IllumiNative does with this research, and then it complements the work of organizations like the College Fund.
Wayne, how does story and data balance for you?
I think we'll +1 to everything Cheryl said there. But the balance between story and data, I think, is you can't have a good one without the other one. So I think the best stories are always well informed. They come from a base, even a fiction story generally has a kernel of truth in it. And when I think about how we apply it at Intertribal Agriculture Council is we're really trying to do some cutting edge things around data visualization to help people see data in different ways, right? So oftentimes we get these huge data reports that are narrative in nature. And one of the things that we think is important is the visual aspect that data can be applied through. And so how do we take that data, put it into graphs and pictures on maps and overlay things so that folks can see the impact in a new and different way? One of the beautiful things we're doing currently is we have a map of the United States, including Alaska and Hawaii. We overlay Indian country on top of that, which is the federally recognized reservations. We have another data overlay that shows Native population based on census, right? That shows while there are definitely Native folks living on reservation, a lot of our people live off reservation. And then in IAC's work, we're able to then overlay things like food insecurity or credit deserts. And in the work that we do in Indian Ag, helping people see the commonality in those deficits where Indian country is allows for us to then be able to articulate the need for programming and funding to help us do the work that we do. And so that data and the way we use it helps us to tell our story in a couple different mediums that allow for folks to understand and help us push IAC's mission forward.
Kathy.
Of course, yeah, these are great, hard to follow acts. Just grounding in the 2017 reveal of the first Reclaiming Native Truth, I think one of the things that I experienced in the room is that the facts and the insights and the learnings from that research were not surprising to me as a Native woman. They were highly validating in the spaces that I walk in, which is predominantly in non-Indian culture. I'm an urban Native. I've been in Washington, D.C. a very long time, and unless my fellow brothers and sisters are either working in D.C., experiencing the things I am, or they're coming to visit for a policy summit, and we're out at night at dinners and stuff, I'm oftentimes the only person in those spaces, and I feel like a sense of responsibility for just educating. I don't mean that it's not like an emotional labor thing, it's just something that I feel is the family I was born into and the place that I've been given, the gifts I've been given, and the ability to sit at the tables I've sit at. I carry a tremendous sense of just ownership for that. But I think the validation of that research for me gave me a lot of aha moments in non-Indian world and in communications where I feel often like it's very hard when you want to explain mascots and you want to explain why they are dehumanizing and you want to explain anything in our community at sort of at a specific level, you got to go way back and do Indian 101. It's like, let me take you way back and explain to you what these things are. Or if we want to talk about boarding schools, well, let me take you back and talk about assimilation. And so there's a lot of that sort of historical context that I feel in the research when I saw it. I'm like, well, none of these things have been taught from the beginning. And so for me, I think the research has given me just a tremendous amount of being able to insert my voice that's backed by facts, data, information. That's scientific, that's science, it's not my opinion. I have strong opinions, as anybody who knows me would know. But when I have a body of research and amounts of work that have been done to basically prove things that I already knew, but now they're grounded in science, I feel that it's been incredibly empowering in the spaces that I've walked in. And I've directed many people to this. Again, I'm not providing big presentations on IllumiNative research or reclaiming Native truth research, but there's subtle moments where I've really been able to lean into it and be able to prove points and support my own opinions when needed.
I went back and read what I wrote from 6 years ago, and one of the things that stuck with me was that there's already a sense from general population that there is a desire that history is wrong and it needs to be corrected. And in fact, in the Reclaiming Native Truth data, was 78% wanted a complete history, which is an amazing thing to start from when people already want this information. How do you get it out to them? And I see you nodding, Mary Kathryn, so let's start with you.
Well, it's just interesting. I'm sitting here thinking because, I'm not someone who spends a lot of time collecting data, but as Kathy was pointing out, like what we can do with that data is actually pretty amazing once we have it. And, you're giving that statistic, and I'm just thinking about pushing Native stories in like Hollywood and theaters and places where we have previously been excluded. A lot of times the pushback we would get is from the people who have the money that produce these stories, whether it's on stage or TV, would say, well, or this is what was said to me 10 years ago, before Reclaiming Native Truth came out. They would say, for instance, Mary Kathryn, you're such a good writer, how wonderful, what a great story you've written, but, we're gonna be honest with you for a moment, you're only 1% of the population and we gotta sell tickets, right? And there's a couple things to unpack there. One is the assumption that a good Native story can't be enjoyed by a non-Native, which is ridiculous. We all can enjoy great stories by anyone of any ethnicity because a good story is a good story. But the other thing is just that, that non-Natives aren't interested in our stories. They are, and they also want to know the truth about their own American history. But we don't, until now, we really haven't had the data on that. And what I will say is just anecdotally, when I would walk into the lobby after one of my plays, people would be standing around and I would overhear their conversations and they would say, oh my God, I can't believe I didn't know that. No one ever told me. How do I know more? I'm appalled at my ignorance. I'm interested in knowing the truth. I feel personally wronged that I was misinformed as a child in the American school system. But before all this research was done, we didn't have the data to go to the people with the money in these studios or theaters that produce stories, right, and say, no, there is an interest, right? Now we also have these models, and we can point to Prey or Reservation Dogs, right? These shows and say, hey, look, Larissa Fast Horse was on Broadway. We have these examples now where Native shows are doing well, selling out at theaters. But again, it's when you don't have that data and you're just relying on anecdotes, it can be really difficult to have those conversations with folks outside of our community.
Kathy, let me ask you from the Washington Post, you're trying to basically reorganize how news right now is being viewed, and history doesn't quite fit into those categories the way, but yet there's this missing element from education that suddenly is foisted on journalism.
I think, I would point everyone, if you haven't seen it yet, we did a series where we started an investigative story on Native American boarding schools, and that was published just this month. And if anyone wants to talk to me afterward, I'd be happy to share a link with you to read it. But, it is one of those spaces, and the reporters, by the way, are Dana Hedgepeth and Sari Horowitz, who are, Dana is a member of the Haliwa Saponi Nation, and Sari is a longtime investigative reporter of the Washington Post, and wow, are they powerful? In terms of what's been revealed. It is, as I sort of reflect on that and I hear responses from readers who are experiencing it, it is predominantly a non-Native crowd who are reading these stories. And I think it is being brought to a level that, from a mainstream perspective, is really a tremendous opportunity for us to be able to educate. They're very tough stories. We all know them. It's my story too. It's your family's story. It's our community story. But I have many people who have approached me after the story was published or, in and out of the Washington Post who have said, oh my gosh, I had no idea. I never knew this had happened. And that alone to me is just proving that we are breaking new ground and reaching levels that we haven't before. So I think, the Washington Post covers a lot of different things, but I mean, seeing this story on the front page, the homepage, and also the front page of the Sunday paper a couple weekends ago, I mean, I couldn't be more encouraged by that in terms of the opportunity and the opportunity for journalism. And also, I just want to credit a lot of the Native publishers out there, including ICT, who've done a tremendous amount of work in this space. It takes all of us to be able to shine a light and educate, but the power of the Washington Post is a pretty significant place for me.
Yeah, I'm reflecting back on like the last 8 years. And as we all know, there have been some incredible headwinds that have risen up in terms of our sharing of our narrative and our sharing of our knowledge. And when I think about how things are different now, we are definitely, as Indigenous people, as Native people, we're definitely in a different space. I see a lot of really brilliant storytellers, brilliant writers, filmmakers, people in the entertainment industry. I can't say that I saw those 8 years ago, quite as much as like right here in this space, that we didn't have this kind of convening. We didn't have the kind of information that we could respond to. We also, I think, have capitalized on resources that didn't kind of really exist for us maybe 8 or 10 years ago, like social media or like streaming services or, like film and entertainment partnerships. That really wasn't there. I see a lot of different kind of talent emerging and people using, Native people we're quite brilliant, and we have been able to open doors for ourselves that we didn't previously have open. I think the other thing that I've observed is, we have some really good allies, but we still need a lot of allies. We still have a lack of investment by philanthropy in Native people. We still have a lack of investment by, the government and philanthropy and others in education. So I think that, when I think back, we've had these tremendous changes, but against these really incredibly challenging headwinds, but at the same time, we still have a lot of work. I think that this research that we'll be hearing about will help us kind of look at, well, what can we do now? How can we build on our talent and our experiences and our knowledge, and look at some ways to expand that. Yeah. I was going to do a princess wave when I came in, but thought we're going to all practice that.
Well, let me follow up before I get to Wayne and throw you a softball with that. And that is that we know from the data that the United States is going into the smallest workforce in its history. And yet Indian country has a young population, and all it needs is education to add to the mix.
Right, I think that's really true, and everything that we look at has education components to it, but that investment in early childhood and K-12 education, and then in a post-secondary, whatever route it is that people take, is so essential, and we still don't have, kind of like widespread commitment to that. And so that, that's the area that I try to stay focused in. And that really wasn't a softball because I don't really play sports. I watch sports. I like to do that part, but that just felt like, a very gentle touch.
Okay. So Wayne, if the research shows people are already interested in learning more, how do we then make that so?
I think it's finding the right avenue to gather resources to ensure that our storytelling comes from a place of what is appropriate for us and palatable to the broader public. And what I mean by that is, I want to pick up on something Kathy said earlier about, the research and how it kind of validated a lot of things we knew in Indian country. And I think back to like the Declaration of Independence, where they said, we hold these truths to be self-evident. No one asked them for their research, right? And reminding you that that's the document that called us merciless Indian savages as well. If they'd have done their research, they would have realized that we weren't anything but merciless Indian savages. And so I think for me, we want to make sure that folks understand that these are the truths that we know as Indigenous people, as Native peoples, and the validation is for other people so that they can understand us, which then allows for opportunities to work more rightly in partnership with us to help these stories get out to that broader public so people can realize that, hey, we're still here.
One of the things that you mentioned, Mary Kathryn, that I kind of wanted to follow up on is with, again, going back to 6 years ago, there wasn't a lot of media activity, particularly from Hollywood, and now there's much more. And you mentioned that when these shows hit, they're instantly popular and people want to watch them. And yet that message doesn't seem to get through to Hollywood. When they fund new projects and you look at the pipeline 5 years from now, it's not the same as it was 5 years ago.
Yeah, it's true. And, you know, I think that we're seeing more doors open to Native creatives in Hollywood for sure. Absolutely. I mean, I'm personally seeing it just in the work that I am getting hired to do. And, you know, I think we can point to examples of Native creatives getting to be above the line on projects, and that's super, super exciting. But I think we still have so much work to do in educating folks because there's still, without naming names, Taylor Sheridan, there's still a lot of work being done where people are making stories about us, right? And without us in the room, or in ways that are harmful or using stereotypes, right? And so how do we continue to do that educational work? It's like we're going to be taking 2 steps forward and then there's a step back, and just because we have some really great shows that are made and produced by Natives doesn't mean that others can't create shows that are harmful, you know, and or do harm. And I think, you know, one of the things IllumiNative recently did was put out a toolkit for any show that's covering missing and murdered Indigenous issues related to missing and murdered Indigenous persons, because it's a really hot topic now out there. There's a bunch of shows focusing on it. And as an attorney who represents about 15 different families of various MMIP victims, I can tell you that when these stories get portrayed in a disrespectful, inaccurate manner by Hollywood, it's very harmful to our families. It's very hurtful. And, you know, so doing that work it's like, yes, we've got to get more Native creatives above that line, but we also have to continue to educate all of our non-Native friends and colleagues in the industry. And that's a really challenging thing to do, and they aren't always the most receptive, but I think that's starting to change too.
When you think about these stories, and this can open up for anybody, is how do they educate beyond just telling a good story? And should they? And I'm talking about the world of fiction and television particularly.
Well, I think I'll just jump in. You know, I think that's a real challenge that Native creatives face, is there's almost, and I'm someone who loves that education can be a component of my storytelling, and I purposely sprinkle in pieces of history throughout my work, and I love doing that because I see the past as present. I don't think the past is behind us. I think it's in front of us, and it's enveloping us right now, and if we don't pay attention to it, that's usually to our own detriment. But I say that because that's me personally and how I love to work as a writer and a creative. But I think for a lot of our Native creatives, it can feel really burdensome, this idea that they have to educate the audience and for the audience to understand the stories they're telling. And I know a lot of Native creatives will say, I don't care. I'm not writing for the non-Native audience. If there are inside jokes, if there are acronyms, if there's lingo, if there are experiences that my characters are talking about that non-Natives are not going to understand, too bad. I don't care about that. And I think that's a very valid way to approach storytelling too. You know, it's something that our white mainstream community will never have to experience, because when they sit and write a story like Mad Men or whatever, you know, I'm trying to think of like whatever that mainstream show is, which is a great show, right? But like the main character, John Hamm's guy, you know, they don't have to do a lot of explaining for people to understand where that character's coming from, right? Like that is America, right? That is, even though America is way more diverse than that. So, you know, I think sad baby. I think that, you know, that's a burden that our community uniquely carries and that other communities, marginalized communities, also do in terms of the need to educate. And I think different writers approach that differently. And I don't necessarily know that I have individually found the right balance. I try to find the right balance for me in my writing. But I know that other, you know, communities of color and marginalized communities have expressed that challenge as well in the work that they're creating.
Yeah, I think it's one of the most frustrating things about being Native, right? Because when I think about the media, the Native creative page, it's the same thing for us in education. You know, I'm constantly in environments where I have to do not just Indians 101, but I have to say it's not enough to say Indigenous inclusion, that you actually have to do something. And I think that it is a shared experience that we have as Indigenous peoples. And I would just encourage us to persevere. You know, our ancestors and us, you know, we're very brave. We have to be very courageous. You're going to hit a lot of walls. You're going to hit those headwinds that I talked about. But we really have no choice as Indigenous peoples but to persist and to speak out. You know, one of the things that I have encouraged us to do is, you know, don't succumb, I guess, to that that sort of backlash that's occurring right now. I tell people I feel like I'm in the multiverse, where on the one hand, we're all together here and we're advocating and we're investing and we're putting our whole hearts into something, and then on the other, in my other universe, people are like, well, I can't come to your convening because Native higher ed policy sounds too much like DEI. And so you just have this like really potentially crazy-making kind of experience, but don't succumb to that. You know, stick to the calling that we have, really, to speak out on behalf of our people, to create a better path. I like what Kathryn, what MK said about the present. The past is present. It does envelope us. It's each other and our ancestors kind of giving us that guidance and that support. And so I just really encourage us to, you know, persevere. We're going to hear positive things in the next couple of days, and we're also going to hear things that are really disheartening to us. And so, you know, I just want to restate what I shared earlier. We're quite brilliant. You are brilliant people, and you can persevere through that, those challenges, through those headwinds, and make changes for ourselves and for, you know, coming generations. Because I do think that it's just a constant challenge, so you have to stand up and really, you know, act in really brave ways.
I would so agree with that. I think, as I've told Crystal many times, that you have to be a squeaky wheel, and I'm a squeaky wheel, and I'm just not going to stop. I mean, I think, you know, if I look at where we've come since 2017, you know, we didn't have reservation dogs, we didn't have Rutherford Falls, we didn't have Secretary Holland, we didn't have some of the representation that we have now. But I'm also still really discouraged about what hasn't happened. So there's still a long way to go, and there's still so much work to do. I think, you know, when you tell a story in a mainstream space like we do in journalism and like we've just done this month, it opens up a whole host of opportunity for representation, for education. And I think a big part of storytelling, I just want to say, is also listening. You know, we know the research, we know what it says, we know that people don't understand, but we also know that the kinds of questions that are still being asked of us are still happening, and we need to understand it. And they're uncomfortable sometimes and painful to hear when people misunderstand us, but we must know that perception exists so that we know how to truth tell, and we know how to tell the next story, the next big opportunity when it comes to the table.
Wayne? Do you want to add anything, Wayne?
I can't follow that much brilliance. I'm going to be quiet.
I think we have some questions coming, but first I just want to ask one that literally takes the question that Crystal raised yesterday, and that is how the mission of research from this conference should be shaped into what comes out of it. And so I'm curious on your takes on what's really important to distill and go forward with. And start with Cheryl.
Yeah, I think we should revisit the approach that we have used. We've used it's for us, and it helps us educate ourselves and tell the story, and it's for allies. And I think that it would be really useful for us to think about, what do we really want from allies? So I attended a higher education policy conference that was about a response to affirmative action. And the first day, you know, among the things that people talked about was Native education, Native higher education, and the impact of affirmative action on us. And the next morning, they got up and they said, what did we learn yesterday? We learned that we need to be inclusive of indigenous people. And I felt like saying a bad word or two because it was performative. And I think we should expect better from our allies, that they should do better than performative. And so then we need to be able to say, well, what do we actually need? And I said, well, we actually need you to invest in Native people using their own voice around policy for higher education. We need to be able to do that. And so I think I hope over the next couple of days that we will talk more about what should allies really do. What are the kinds of investments they make? And I want to say that from a philanthropic perspective, it's really nice that philanthropy wants to be indigenized. They need to give us $10 billion. And so I think we need to keep doing that. I've actually been in meetings, and I know those of you who do fundraising here, I've been in meetings where we've said, well, you know, it's 4.4% of funding in the United States goes to Native-led organizations. And nobody stands up and says, oh my God, that's appalling, we're going to give you $1 billion. And really, that's what allies should do. They should fork their money over and do that to support us. So that's my speech. I invite my nieces and my nephew to follow that.
Very good. Wayne, what's your research agenda?
I think research only goes to amplify indigenous wisdom. And I think as we are learning more through this research, and Indian country is going through a healing process, I think we need to take factor in the healing that needs to come from understanding these things in deeper and different contexts, because that's the beauty of Indian country is we kind of have this common value amongst just about every Native population I've came across, which is generosity. And so as we continue to learn and heal ourselves, we're going to end up healing the world like we normally do. So I think that's what I would call us to pay attention to, is how do we use research to help us heal ourselves so that we can heal others.
Very good. Kathy.
Sure. Well, I think a couple things. I think, first, I agree so much about allyship, and having worked now and most of my career in non-Native spaces, there are amazing allies out there. So I just want to say thank you to all the allies who are there for us. A lot of the work I've been able to do is because a non-Native person has been able to pave that way or support the efforts in some way, whether I was at Nike or at the Post or otherwise. So that's the first thing. I think the other thing is, for me, you know, my takeaway will be, how do I serve as a better truth teller? How do I make sure that where I can, you know, again, I'm not a reporter, so I'm not necessarily writing the story, but my role is to elevate the story and make sure that it is reached by the mainstream. And how can I use the work that we have, the research that we have, in order to inform, in order to support, in order to amplify? So I think, you know, and also I think in the field of journalism, it's a space that I feel and care deeply about, as it's a very tough business to tell the truth, to go after a story, to publish a story. And so however I can support my fellow brethren in the journalism community with this research, I want to be a part of that.
It's funny because I think about my long arc of a career and how different it was in the beginning when news organizations had so much money and now they're all scrambling, and just that narrative change is.
It's a tough, tough business, Mark,
It's a
as you
tough
know.
business.
But we're doing. I mean, there is a great need for journalism. We will always need journalism.
Thank you. And Mary Kathryn.
You know, thank you for calling on me last. It gave me a chance to reflect for a second. You know, I was just thinking about, as everyone was talking, what would I leave as my parting thoughts for this entire time we have together? And I realize I get very siloed now. I like to do this sort of cross-pollination of storytelling, theater, film, and the law. But those are my two lanes that I stay in, and what is amazing about what this convening has the potential to do is you're bringing in so many different subject matter experts from all these different fields and all this different research, and there really are a lot of connections to make. And I'll just give an example. When I was doing the federal judiciary sort of legal research, you know, I was really blown away by one thing that kept coming out in some of the interviews I was doing with some of the federal judges who actually said to me, you know, what are kids learning in elementary school? Because if they're not learning in elementary school that there are 3 sovereigns in the Constitution, that one is the states, one is the federal government, and one is tribal governments, how do you expect them to learn that when they get on the federal bench or on the Supreme Court? If they didn't learn that in elementary school when they learn to respect their state government and their federal government. You know, and so thinking about, wow, there's this huge connection here between the judicial and legal research and educational research, right? And how do we shape that curriculum? We can draw those parallels through a lot of the different sort of subject matter areas that we're going to be talking about. And so just always thinking about when we're listening and absorbing or hearing our colleagues present, what are those connecting points and where do we need to be connecting these dots? Because I think that's the real benefit of having this kind of a convening, is it allows us to do that in a way that's different than just sitting and reading through the research, which for some of us is not as productive or enabling for creative thinking outside the box.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists, Cheryl, MK, Wayne, and Kathy. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for